Good evening. Welcome to the Maison Française. I'm thrilled to welcome tonight to the Maison Française Professor Elisabeth Ladenson, a dear colleague, a very important member of our department, Department of French. For those who had not been paying attention, Professor Ladenson is a leading figure in 19th and 20th century French literature. Is there a problem with that microphone? It feels like, no, it's working well? Excellent, excellent. Elisabeth Ladenson is the author of two influential monographs, Proust Lesbianism, published in 1999, and Dirt for Art's Sake, Books on Trial, from Madame Bovary to Lolita, published in 2006, and both were published by Cornell University Press. These books have earned international recognition, and notably Proust Lesbianism has been translated in both French and Spanish. In addition to her books, Professor Ladenson has published numerous articles and book chapters and has been invited to lecture in major institutions across the United States and abroad. She also contributes regularly to prominent literary journals and magazines in both English and French, including the London Review of Books and the Magazine Littéraire. Within our department at Columbia, Professor Ladenson plays a vital role in fostering intellectual and community life, and most significantly, she served as the general editor of the Romanic Review since 2006, a position through which she has strengthened the journal's scholarly reputation and international reach. Let me add something a little more personal about Professor Ladenson that I think is meaningful in the context of tonight's talk. Professor Ladenson is very funny. To be honest, she is the most powerfully funny person I know at Columbia. In any case, a person who makes me laugh the hardest, to my own detriment, I must say, sometimes. But I will not go there tonight. I think she would object to the idea that she practices or she uses Jewish humor, although this could be debated as much as the idea that Proust practices Jewish humor, something that is at the heart of her presentation tonight. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Ladenson and her talk, who's going to give a talk called Proust, Antisemitism and Jewish Humor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that very nice introduction. I should mention that it's really, saying that I'm funny before I get up and give a talk is kind of alarming, but I'll try. I'll do my best. And also, everyone knows that you're not supposed to talk about humor if you hope to amuse. But, I mean, there's nothing more lethal than academic discourse on humor, so without further ado, I'm just going to give you my talk. Is the microphone level okay? Can you all hear me without being bellowed at? Yeah? Okay. So, Proust, Antisemitism, and Jewish Humor. Here are two sentences I've run across repeatedly in commentaries over the years with minor variations. One, no one has ever been more of a snob than Proust. Two, no one has ever been less of a snob than Proust. In each of these is usually preceded by, of course. Of course, no one has ever been more of a snob than Proust. Of course, no one has ever been less of a snob than Proust. Neither of these assertions is accurate, although I believe the first to be considerably less implausible than the second. But both can be and have been asserted as evident truths. How can we account for this? It's not simply because great works of art necessarily lend themselves to infinite interpretation. I've tried to think of equivalent statements about Joyce, say, or Nabokov, and while I know that there are divergent opinions about these authors and their works, it's hard to imagine that anyone has ever maintained, for instance, that Finnegan's Wake is the most readable of novels, or that the author of Lolita was, of all men, the least susceptible to the charms of young girls. Proust elicits these violently contradictory interpretations because he wrote a 3,000-page novel which contradicts itself all over the place. To believe that he was the least snobbish of people requires both the willingness to read all 3,000 pages and a great deal of credulity, since the narrative trajectory of the work is predicated on a series of reversals, and one of them is that the narrator starts out as a duchess-worshipping snob, but is eventually disabused of this, comes to realize that the beau monde of the aristocracy is le royaume du néant, the kingdom of nothingness, and so retreats, now fully de-snobbed, to his cork-lined room, where he prepares to start writing the novel, which may or may not coincide with the one we've just finished. À la recherche du temps perdu resembles the Bible in its multifarious, self-contradictory capaciousness. Both books, and indeed both are sets of books, offer endless fodder for any argument one might wish to make and any interpretation one might wish to advance. Complicating all this further in the case of Proust is that the author closely resembles his narrator protagonist, with the notable exception that Proust himself was a closeted half-Jewish homosexual, whereas his fictional avatar is a Catholic heterosexual with a strangely keen interest in both Jewishness and same-sex love. Antisemitism. In 1896, shortly after the Dreyfus Affair had begun tearing French society apart, Proust wrote a letter to Count Robert de Montesquieu, which has given rise to interpretations as polarized as those of his snobbery. The letter explains to Montesquieu, a notorious dandy, an aristocratic snob, anti-Dreyfusard, and anti-Semite, why Proust had not responded that afternoon to a question about the Jews. It's for a very simple reason, he says. While I am Catholic like my father and brother, my mother is Jewish. Monsieur will understand that under the circumstances, I could not participate in such a discussion. With elaborate politeness, he adds that he felt it was best to express himself in writing, and also that since their ideas on the subject differ, or rather since he, Proust, is not at liberty to harbor those ideas which he might have otherwise, he wanted to make sure that his interlocutor did not find himself in the position of inadvertently offending him. The letter concludes by saying that he will, of course, always be interested in hearing Montesquieu's views about political and social matters, even if considerations of propriety, une raison de suprême convenance, prevent him from sharing them. Proust's explanation that my mother is Jewish, although I'm Catholic like my father and brother, has always struck me as reminiscent of those T-shirts which used to be sold in gay bookshops in the 80s and 90s, bearing the slogan, I'm not gay, but my boyfriend or girlfriend is. As Proust well knew, according to Jewish tradition, a Jew is someone whose mother is Jewish. And yet Proust, like his father and brother, had been baptized Catholic, and according to Catholicism, a Catholic is someone who has been baptized and confirmed as Catholic. Proust was therefore not so much Jewish on his mother's side and Catholic on his father's, as at once entirely Jewish because his mother was Jewish, and entirely Catholic because he had been baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church. Proust's relation to all this is particularly complicated then, although in fact, there are lots and lots of other people in the same position whose relation to all of this was much less complicated than his, including his own brother, but his relation to all this was in fact particularly complicated. But awkward social moments like the one alluded to in the letter were necessarily far from rare during this period, and also every other period. The writer Emmanuel Berle, for instance, who was born in 1892 into a family similar to that of Proust's mother, a prosperous Parisian Jewish family, and thus a small child when all this was going on, recounts his mother's story about finding herself among people who started making anti-Semitic remarks. She had felt very uncomfortable, not knowing how to tell them that she was Jewish. It seemed very rude not to say anything. In the end, she told them, plunging them into deep embarrassment. These two minor incidents would seem at first glance to be quite similar. Both are demonstrations of a particular social conundrum faced by members of an at least ostensibly invisible minority, which is, ostensibly invisible is a very strange category, but please bear with me, when in the presence of members of the dominant group, unaware that the person they are inviting to join them in reviling that minority actually belongs to it. But then Jewishness has in common with what Proust calls inversion, a peculiarly contradictory mythology according to which each identity is alternatively or alternately, or even sometimes simultaneously, invisible and immediately identifiable. Indeed, this is part of why they're both so dangerous. In addition to bearing the evident stigmata of their degenerate group, Jews and homosexuals are also able to pass unnoticed among the honest citizenry, so that one never quite knows whom one is talking to. Proust's own depictions of both Jews and inverts partake of this ambiguity or ambivalence. Sometimes their difference is readily apparent and they stick out like sore thumbs in polite, that is, normal, Gentile, heterosexual society, whereas at other times they blend in seamlessly and one doesn't quite know who is who or what is what. In the Recherche, moreover, this, like everything else, is subject to the vagaries of time and also perception, with the result that the Baron de Charlus is aggressively virile at times before turning into a flamboyant pederast at others. Swann is barely Jewish at all, and then eventually morphs into, well, he's barely Jewish at all while also being the Jew everyone knows, and then eventually morphs into an Old Testament prophet and outspoken Dreyfusard at the end of his life. And the hero's friend Bloch appears to undergo the opposite mutation. He changes his name to Jacques du Rosier, which eventually has the effect of making his nose grow smaller and his vulgar demeanor gentlemanly, a metamorphosis nonetheless belied by the fact that his chosen aristocratic name echoes that of the Rue des Rosiers, main drag of Paris's Jewish quarter. The transformation of Albert Bloch into Jacques du Rosier works well for him, both socially and professionally, except that it recalls the old joke about Monsieur Katzmann, who decides he's had enough of being taken for the immigrant Jew he in fact is, and so translates his name into French, Katzmann yielding shalom, shalom. The situations, thank you for laughing at that. I think it's funny. The situations evoked in Proust, I gave this same talk at Yale last week and everyone sat stony-faced until I said the word joke, at which point everyone felt free to think things were funny. The situations evoked in Proust's letter to Montesquieu and Berle's account of his mother's story both depict something the sociologist Irving Goffman analyzed in his 1962 study, Stigma. The excruciatingly awkward encounter between clueless anti-Semites and hapless Jews places the social onus necessarily on the latter to either shut up and listen to the maligning of their identity or else to commit an unforgivable breach of decorum. They thus not only suffer the indignity of saying nothing in the face of calumny of their entire group, but are also left open to further damage in the form of having to listen to eventual accusations of having, as it were, entrapped the calumniators by failing to warn them that their calumny had been falling on the ears of the calumnied. Goffman discusses this situation under the rubric, the management of undisclosed discrediting information about self, and offers as an example the dilemma of the ex-mental patient. It is not that he must face prejudice against himself, but rather that he must face unwitting acceptance of himself by individuals who are prejudiced against persons of the kind he can be revealed to be. In brief, Goffman explains passing, and he later adds, parenthetically, thus arises one variety of what is called an embarrassing incident. That's apparently the social science term for this is an embarrassing incident. If the situation of the ex-mental patient in mid-20th century America and that of the Jew in Dreyfus-era France can be compared and even conflated, it is not merely because Goffman discusses various forms of the management of social stigma in general, but also because these forms of spoiled identity, as he calls them in his subtitle, the Jew and the former mental patient, are explicitly cited as being parallel or even interchangeable in mid-20th century America. In these examples, Proust and Berle provide us with two salient instances of what happens when Goffman calls the management of undisclosed discrediting information about self fails. The delicacy of an embarrassing incident of this sort always falls on the stigmatized, hence Proust's explanation of why he kept silent during his conversation with Montesquieu, and his wish to avoid putting his interlocutor into an awkward situation as the reason for his bringing it up at all. Similarly, Berle's mother's discomfort, not knowing how to let the anti-Semites know she was Jewish and thus spare them embarrassment. Both cases culminate in a decision that the best course is to come clean. Although no one emerges clean from this sort of encounter, everyone differently besmirched. Madame Berle's interlocutors are made terribly uncomfortable by the realization that they have been waxing jovially anti-Semitic in the presence of a Jew, and this is somehow her fault. It's like an apocalyptic version of the familiar banal dilemma of talking to someone who has spinach caught in their teeth. Do you point it out with embarrassment on both sides? Or do you say nothing, knowing that they will inevitably learn about it later on and blame you retrospectively in your absence for not having said anything? In this case, the problem is the result not of reckless salad consumption, but of toxic racism. Yet the structure is the same, with the blameless interlocutor bearing responsibility for dealing with a situation not of their making, but nonetheless becomes their burden. Anti-Semitism differs from leftover greenery in the teeth, though, in that what is revealed is hatred or contempt or suspicion or all three towards the hapless interlocutor because of an essential rather than contingent quality. And yet Proust responds as though his relation to Jewishness were contingent rather than essential, some maternal salad residue rather than his own identity. Unlike Madame Berle in any case, Proust cannot simply say, I didn't feel that it would be right to engage in this discussion because, in fact, as you could not have known, I myself am Jewish, because he was not, in fact, Jewish. He was, however, a Dreyfusard. This much is known, although not alluded to here, and indeed had likely not been alluded to during the conversation in question. Nonetheless, well, I mean, he was not, in fact, Jewish. He did not consider himself to be Jewish. That's, which is not quite the same thing as we have learned. As history has taught us, they're not the same thing. Nonetheless, he goes on to say not merely that he felt it would be inappropriate to say anything because his mother is Jewish, but further hedges his bets by noting that his mother's being Jewish means that he is constrained in his opinions. This implies, without actually stating, that if he were not so constrained, he might well hold opinions similar to those of Montesquieu on the Jewish question. Proust's embarrassing incident, therefore, is truly not the same as that of Madame Berle, because while it does, in fact, involve what Goffman calls the management of undisclosed discrediting information about self, Proust explains the situation in a manner which suggests that his undisclosed discrediting information is not really about him. Rather, it is something that isn't about him, yet nonetheless affects him because of his keen sense of propriety. Nor, I suspect, does he think that he faces unwitting acceptance via the ignorance of his interlocutor. Instead, he faces a situation entirely undealt with by Goffman. Both parties, Montesquieu and Proust, seem to be playing disingenuous little games. Montesquieu has been baiting Proust, trying to get him to either agree or disagree with his anti-Semitic remarks. That is, to either disavow his maternal heritage or admit to being a Jew. And Proust is trying to avoid this trap by pretending he doesn't know it's a trap. Yet he still has to choose, so he finesses the question, admitting that his mother is Jewish, yet insisting that he himself is not. And thus he is able to add, without disavowing his maternal heritage exactly, that he is not free to hold the opinions he might well espouse if he were not bound by maternal fealty to refuse to hold them. That is to say, he might well be an anti-Semite if he were free to do so, but he is not free to do so. This letter has been endlessly cited, especially in recent years, most often as Proust's magnificently courageous response to Montesquieu's provocations. It has also, more reasonably, I would say, been taken as a demonstration of his sycophantic hypocrisy in the face of an imperious anti-Semitic aristocrat's reprehensible behavior. His ultimate revenge on Montesquieu would be to paint his recognizable portrait as the increasingly deranged sodomite Charlus in his novel. In Combray, the first section of the first volume, there's a strange scene in which we first meet Bloch and are told about the protagonist's grandfather's jocular habit of suspecting all the narrator's schoolmates of being Jewish, all the protagonist schoolmates of being Jewish, even in the absence of any evidence. As is also true now, there were at the time only two categories of people who spent time and energy spotting Jews: Jews and anti-Semites. In constructing the narrator's entirely normal Catholic family, Proust had simply taken his maternal grandfather's tendency to identify all his grandson's schoolmates as Jews, as indeed many of them were when they were not Protestants, or in fact both at times, because the sons of Catholic families tended to be sent to Catholic schools, and he converted this behavior into proof positive of the family's casual anti-Semitism, that is to say, Catholic normality. Jewishness in the novel runs through the paternal line and is visible in the name. Swann's daughter, Gilberte, is so eager to rid herself of her father's name that she becomes Mademoiselle de Forcheville before becoming Madame de Saint-Loup, and even mispronounces her father's name when later asked about it, so fraught with Semitic overtones has it become for her, which is very strange because in fact it's not a Jewish name, and the way she pronounces it makes it sound German, which makes it sound like a Jewish name. So it doesn't work. Gluck's daughter too quickly marries a Gentile. Entirely absent from the novel is the author's own configuration. There is no character who is Jewish on the mother's side only. And so in the end, it would seem that the Jewish question for Proust boils down to, are you Jewish? And the answer is almost always no. The Jews too can be anti-Semitic in this world, as indeed in our world, as we see in the example of Gluck, who turns out to be the invisible anti-Semite inveighing against the Jewish invasion of Baalbek in the second volume. The only Jews who are not prey to this form of anti-Semitism are the insular Orthodox mentioned parenthetically in the novel's longest sentence, who frequent only their own kind. The rest are all what Jean-Paul Sartre was to call inauthentic Jews, one of several unacknowledged ways in which the Recherche anticipated the latter's Réflexions sur la question juive, translated into English under the title Anti-Semite and Jew, and which helps to explain, I mean, there are many reasons, but it helps to explain Sartre's antipathy towards Proust. In his early attempt at a novel, Jean Santé, written while the Dreyfus Affair was going on, the latter is the Dreyfus Affair is a direct, though lightly disguised focus of sustained attention, with the young protagonist attending Zola's trial and a great deal of often incoherent discussion of the matter. The Santé family, too, is Catholic, but the youthful writing is much more directly autobiographical, and Jewishness keeps intruding in ways that muddy the waters. Proust's eventual solution was to make the Jewish question one in which the protagonist could only be implicated on the side of anti-Semitism, which of course remuddied those waters in different and even muddier ways. One can never, it seems, get rid of the mud of Jewishness, as Hannah Arendt was to put it in her writing on anti-Semitism, the Dreyfus Affair, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, for which she takes the Recherche as an exemplary demonstration, quote, Jews had been able to escape from Judaism into conversion. From Jewishness, there was no escape, close quote. Proustian humor. Proust is not generally viewed as a comical writer. That was not funny. This is not merely because his reputation is that of a daunting and therefore serious author, but also because the most familiar passages in his magnum opus are mostly devoid of comedy. The opening section, the goodnight kiss scene, the Petite Madeleine and attendant ruminations on time and memory, and the conclusion to the final volume, that is to say the parts he wrote first, which were intended to provide a highly serious overarching structure to the work as a whole, and which are also the passages most often quoted, alluded to, and assigned. These greatest hits set pieces are the most humor-free in the novel. And it is what comes in between, the parts that are much less familiar, which are filled with various kinds of comedy, and especially rich in the sort of acutely observed social comedy, in the absence of which I would hazard that the intervening pages would probably not just generally unread, but generally unreadable. The topic of humor in Proust's work has not been the focus of much scholarly attention. There have been a few articles, and as far as I know, one monograph, Maya P. Slater's 1979 humor in the works of Proust, published by Oxford University Press as a reworking of her Oxford thesis on the same subject. And Maya P. Slater, went on to teach French literature and to translate Molière and La Fontaine. But what she's best known as is the author of highly successful Jane Austen fan fiction, notably Mr. Darcy's Diary and the Private Diary of Mr. Darcy. I felt compelled to add that. Slater's, so 1979, Slater's, like other academic treatments, is mostly, she's also the daughter-in-law of the author of, the P stands for Pasternak, and was the daughter-in-law, I think, no, or niece or something of Boris Pasternak, author of Dr. Zhivago. So Maya P. Slater, very interesting. Slater's, like other academic treatments, is mostly occupied with thematic taxonomic breakdowns of the comedic aspects of Proust's novel. The other more popular approach is the anthology or compilation of humorous passages from the Recherche, of which at least two have been published in France in recent years. How successful at capturing Proustian humor is this approach? Not very, is the short answer. My own best attempt at a taxonomy of Proustian humor has led to the following provisional and admittedly somewhat chaotic classification. First, there is what is labeled in the work itself as humor, what the characters laugh at. One salient subcategory of this is something like a meta-humor in which what various characters find comical is offered up as ridiculous and made into another sort of comedy. Examples of this abound in Un Amour de Swann, as when Dr. Cottard, who has grasped that people enjoy jokes and know what they sound like but doesn't really understand how they work, offers free association sallies to find that Madame Verdurin has deemed him and them hilarious, with the result that the reader is invited to laugh at something like anti-humor, a simulacrum of humor taken as the real thing, laughed at by the petit noyau because it's been agreed that Cottard's remarks are humorous, which is in itself funny, specifically to the extent that they are not, in fact, funny. And then we are further given the comic spectacle of Madame Verdurin's miming of barely suppressed hilarity, a simulacrum of laughter provoked by Cottard's simulacrum of humor, enhanced by her protestations of fear of dislocating her jaw, laughing at what has been factitiously established as intensely funny, along with her husband's similar yet distinct silent pipe-wielding portrayal of someone finding something unbearably comic that isn't really funny at all. In the same category, Proust also gives us several further shades of comedy, some of which are ambiguously related to the Verdurin anti- and meta-humor. There are several instances of characters genuinely finding things funny, and if the scenes themselves are comical, it's not because the thing found humorous is anti-funny, but because of the mise en scène of social identification. The first example of this is in Combray, when the housekeeper Françoise, because of her complete immersion in and identification with the family's idiosyncratic subculture, laughs at the spectacle of an ignorant barbare who arrives to pay a visit on Saturday at 11 a.m. only to find the family at table, having failed to realize that, of course, lunch is served an hour early on Saturdays. We, the reader, find this humorous because we recognize that Françoise's sense of the comical is part of her adherence to an eccentric custom which she, along with everyone else present, takes to be normal. But then the situation is complicated by her finding it even more hilarious when the father can't understand why the barbarian in question hadn't known about a rule that she is then revealed to recognize as arbitrary. It is when describing the father's stupefaction at the visitor's failure to understand the Saturday lunch schedule convention that she has to pause to wipe away tears of mirth. This is entirely different from Madame Verdurin's extravagant appreciation of Cottard's idiotic sallies, because we understand that Françoise genuinely finds the situation comical, and we understand why, and we further understand that it is indeed somewhat funny on a number of levels. We laugh both with and at Françoise as she laughs both with and at the father and the visitor in equal measure. My highly complete taxonomy includes two further categories. One is the lowest form of Proustian humor and the one which has aged the least well. This is the narrator's own tenacious insistence on the linguistic mistakes of others. When the pretentious Bloch pronounces lift as lift or Venice as Venice, because it is kind of funny, I have to admit. Because of his conviction that the letter I is always long in English, we may smile, if only because we've heard English mangled in this matter, although we've similarly mangled other languages, including French, so our smile may be brief. But Françoise's many errors in grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and pronunciation are less comical, and the lengthy expositions of the Balbec hotel director's mistakes, ponderously retailed every time we encounter that character, which it's exactly like what Balzac does with Nuit Saint-Jean, with the German accent, which is also anti-Semitic, in fact, is an anti-Semitic stereotype. But then the Balbec hotel director, I wonder about him also, that becomes both tedious and somewhat icky, as do the spelling and grammar errors of the servant who steals the protagonist's writing paper and imprudently leaves his letter on the desk for it to be included in the text. These passages are unfunny and unpleasant because they're mocking members of the working class, and also relatedly because these are the passages where we see what makes the narrator himself laugh. We see that what he finds comically inappropriate is when people who lack the sort of education he has been given attempt and necessarily fail to wield idioms beyond their reach. But my point is not to examine the author's linguistic snobbery, rather to catalog the types of humor in his novel. The main category, what kept me reading raptly in my chambre de bonne when I was 19 and first read Proust, is narrative social comedy. And I'm using the terms humor, comedy, and the like interchangeably, even as I realize that one might object to this conflation, and so feel free to object afterwards. What makes the Recherche so very delightfully amusing, to my mind at least, is that throughout his novel, Proust explores the gap between what people intend to convey about themselves and their intentions in general, and in any given circumstances, and what comes across to others, or at least to the discerning and pitiless eye of his narrator, and therefore reader. The first major example of this is the scene early in Combray in which we see the grandmother's sisters, Céline and Flora, attempt to thank Swann for his gift of a case of Asti wine. We have been told that the two spinsters live in a world of their own, animated by a sort of hyperbolic and indeed parodic version of the grandmother's horror of vulgarity. They carry this to the point of being unable effectively to communicate with others, so great is their folie à deux with its attendant revulsion at excessive directness of speech. We have been told about this. We have also seen the father warn them that they should overcome their reticence and thank Swann intelligibly, and so we are able to appreciate their unintelligibly obscure attempts to express thanks, which take the form of skittish allusions. In the absence of this preparation, their oblique expressions of gratitude would be as incomprehensible to the reader as they are to Swann, who cannot understand why the anecdote from Saint-Simon he is trying to tell the grandfather keeps being interrupted by irrelevant remarks about good neighbors and the like. As always, the narrator is there to interpret for us so that we see at once what characters are trying to convey about themselves and their relation to the world, and why and how it inevitably misses its mark. The novel is filled with scenes of this sort in which the comedy arises from the gap between what people actually want and how what they say and do to obtain it while trying to signal virtuous motivations ends up betraying the other baser concerns. In the case of Céline and Florent, the source of their problem is not their laudable desire to thank Swann for his gift, but rather their efforts to avoid vulgarity, which cause them instead to be unwittingly rude, both by failing to express thanks intelligibly and by interrupting the conversation with incomprehensible non sequiturs. Another example from Combray is Françoise's munificent insistence on serving asparagus at every meal, which is retrospectively revealed to be the product not of her culinary zeal so much as her desire to torture the pregnant kitchen maid who is made to prepare them and is allergic to asparagus. This ubiquitous form of comedy in the novel, in which the narrator reveals the base motivations behind seemingly anodyne or even virtuous acts, reaches its apogee in the series of scenes in which the Duc and Duchesse de Guermantes repeatedly ignore very serious situations in the service of not having to curtail their social engagements. The Duchess protests that Swann cannot really be dying, as he has just informed her he is, because to acknowledge this would interfere with their dinner plans. The Duke similarly insists that his cousin can't possibly just have died and is probably now feeling much better in the service of a different soirée. In another scene, the Duke appears inopportunely to pay his respects when the protagonist's grandmother is on her deathbed, unable to grasp that his presence represents not, as he imagines, a great honor, but rather an unwanted intrusion. These passages are not actually funny because the gap we are shown is between social fatuity and genuinely terrible circumstances, and yet the fatuity in question lends them a comical dimension nonetheless, arising from that gap. The scene involving the cousin is the only one that achieves actual humor because we don't know the moribund person in question. Also, he's dead, and the Duke keeps insisting that he's probably feeling much better now, which is, but it's that exaggerated because we don't know the character. In sum, much of the novel is animated by what is observed about Swann early on in Combray. Our social personality is the product of what other people think, and much of its comedy is predicated on an exploration of this theme and people's vain efforts to escape it and define themselves as they wish and not as others may see them. Jewish humor in Proust. This brings me to Jewish humor in Proust. I wrote, having written Jewish humor in Proust. Let me begin by saying that I don't think there is any Jewish humor in Proust. The closest thing to Jewish humor in the novel is the scene in the second volume in which we hear a stream, the scene already alluded to, in which we hear a stream of ripely anti-Semitic pronouncements about there being too many Jews in Baalbek, emanating from a bathing tent from which Gluck eventually emerges. This may or may not have been intended to be humorous by the author. I would imagine that it was. But in the end, it counts, I think, as anti or meta or both Jewish humor. The joke is on Gluck himself, and it's told by the narrator. Otherwise, I can only think of one moment when the protagonist, having been accused of snobbery by Gluck, remarks that if he were really a snob, he would not be hanging around with the likes of Gluck. This is not Jewish humor per se, but it's the only line in the novel which I can imagine being delivered by Groucho Marx. Yet the narrator says it not to Gluck himself, but to the reader, which changes everything. Groucho Marx would have said it to Gluck himself. In short, there is no Jewish humor per se in Proust. Nonetheless, I believe it to be central to Proust's novel, just not in the form of comedy. Instead, it is serious matters that follow the logic of Jewish comedy in Proust's novel. It was Groucho Marx who launched me on this idea, specifically the realization that his famous line, "I wouldn't want to belong to a club that would have me as a member," accounts for a great deal of what happens in Proust's work. This sentence applies to the depictions of love, snobbery, and inversion in the Recherche, and I'll come back to this in a moment. To what extent is Groucho Marx's line a Jewish joke? Its genius and the reason for its staying power is that depending on the context, it reads seamlessly as the expression of a presumably universal truth about human psychology, but in mid-20th century American culture in which it was coined, it carried unmistakable reference to the fact that most social organizations, country clubs and the like, were segregated, or as the euphemism went, restricted, that is to say, exclusive, a word which has come to mean merely fancy and desirable, but in this context, it means excluding Jews along with other ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. Groucho Marx himself, who recorded many slightly different versions of the line in various books and interviews, noted variously that it originated in a telegram he sent either to the Friars Club in New York, an organization for comedians of which most of the membership was necessarily Jewish, given the overwhelming preponderance of Jews among American comedians, or the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles, which was the best known of the clubs founded by Jews in response to their exclusion from the mainstream country clubs. It would seem that he did not solely or even primarily intend the remark in the spirit in which various commentators have taken it, as referring to restricted clubs. And here, this is the case of Ruth Weiss's No Joke, published in in 2013, but rather as an expression of his own contrarian spirit. And there is ample evidence that has often been interpreted with no reference to Jewishness or anti-Semitism, since the internet informs me that a psychological phenomenon referred to as Groucho Marx syndrome has been identified as, I quote from one of the many websites which discuss it, the result of internalized perfectionism. Anyone who suffers from this, says the website, has unreasonable expectations from their own performance. When performing a task, you seem to suffer from procrastination caused by perfectionism, close quote. I leave you to contemplate the extent to which Groucho Marx syndrome is something which applies to Proust or his fictional avatar, or for that matter, anyone in this room. In any case, the line that gave rise to this pop psychology definition reverberates throughout the novel, providing the underlying logic for snobbery, love in general, and same-sex love, or inversion, as he calls it, which is explicitly predicated on the same principle as snobbery, as the narrator observes at one point, noting that what the snob wants is to frequent not other snobs, whom he reviles and flees, but aristocrats, just as the invert desires not his like, but his opposite, that is to say, heterosexual men, the one club guaranteed not to want him as a member. I think he may have actually taken that line out of the novel because it gave too much away, although I'm not absolutely sure. Indeed, all love follows the inversion model. In Proust's world, the headiest aphrodisiac seems to be indifference, ideally tinged with a soupçon of disgust and contempt. Thus, just as homosexual men pursue heterosexual men, the latter pursue lesbians. Only lesbians in this scheme of things seem to actually desire each other, but that's probably because Proust wasn't really interested in thinking this through. And yeah, I know that I wrote an entire book, although it is a small one, on this subject, but I think that's really what it boils down to, is he just really wasn't interested in trying to figure this out. Even the workings of memory function according to the Marxian club logic. Voluntary memory is like the Verdurin salon, in that anyone who wants to can become a member, even if they have to then adhere to a credo which includes finding Cotard's jokes funny. Involuntary memory is the Guermantes salon of anamnesis. It's possible to be invited, but one can never succeed by trying to get in. In addition to the Groucho Marx club line, with its pithy applicability to the laws of both social and erotic desire in the novel, at least two further categories of Jewish humor help to account for large aspects of the Proustian universe. First, let me explain what I mean by Jewish humor. I propose to define this does not account for all of Jewish humor, but I propose to define Jewish jokes as jokes with identifiably inherent Jewish content. Of course, as we have seen in the case of Groucho Marx's club remark, it often depends on who is doing the identifying, but please bear with me. According to Jean-Paul Sartre's famous dictum in Réflexions sur la question juive, Anti-Semite et Jew, published in 1946, which was in fact already articulated by Proust in Sodom et Gomorrah, it is the anti-Semite who makes the Jew. This is arguable, certainly. The Old Testament might beg to differ, for instance, but less arguable, I think, is that it is anti-Semitism that made Jewish humor. The Jews were known as an exceptionally serious and notably humorless people through the 18th century and well into the 19th, that is, until they started assimilating, and as a result, routinely encountering anti-Semitism. Before the 18th century, they were simply busy eating Christian children and desecrating the host. Jewish humor is a response to anti-Semitism, and I believe that Jewish jokes can be divided into three categories. 1, directly about anti-Semitism. 2, indirectly about anti-Semitism. 3, very indirectly about anti-Semitism. There are many examples of each, and there are also, of course, exceptions, but in the interest of time, I have chosen 2 examples of each to demonstrate how these categories work. Here are my 2 jokes from the first category directly about anti-Semitism, and I'm calling my protagonists Jew A and Jew B because it ends up sounding like, usually they give them names and it sounds like Abraham and Isaac walk into a bar, and I really don't like that approach. So Jew A, forgive me, Jew A comes across Jew B reading Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper. He says, What are you reading that terrible paper for? Have you gone crazy? Are you a Nazi now? What is wrong with you? His friend replies, no, calm down. I used to read the Times just like you. But it was so depressing, full of war, famine, genocide, anti-Semitism. But this newspaper is great. In it, I read that the Jews are all rich and they're so powerful that they run the world. What's not to like? 2, Jew A and Jew B are walking around and see a church with a sign outside offering $100 for quick conversion. A turns to B and says, look, $100 for pretending to convert. I'm going to try it. His friend waits for him outside. An hour later, A emerges from the church. B says, so is it true? What happened? Did they really give you $100? A replies, is that all you people think about? These jokes are predicated on taking anti-Semitic cliches literally. Here are 2 examples of my second category, jokes indirectly about anti-Semitism. 1, when he retires from a lengthy career in the garment business, a Jew decides that his next project will be gaining membership in the New York Athletic Club, which was for a very long time an exclusive or restricted club. I'm assuming that's no longer the case, but these jokes come from the mid-20th century. His friends say, are you crazy? They'll never let you in. He says, don't worry, I know what I'm doing. He changes his name, invents a new past for himself, hires a vocal coach, redubs his wife and children with new Anglo-Saxon names and educational trajectories and employment, applies for membership in the New York Athletic Club, and when he gets an interview, goes to Brooks Brothers and buys a new outfit. His interview goes well, and at the end they say, well, all this looks just fine. There's just one more question. What is your religion? To which he replies, oh, we're Goyim. 2, a Jewish woman decides to treat herself and goes to the bar at the Pierre Hotel and orders a martini. Someone walking by inadvertently jostles her elbow, and she spills her drink on her new Chanel suit and exclaims, oy vey, and then adds, whatever that means. In this category, of which there are many more examples, we see Jews attempting, always without success, although or else there would be no joke, to pass as Gentiles. The idea would seem to be that Jewish identity is so inherent that even when it is possible to pass superficially, Jewishness will always out. My third category is jokes which are very indirectly about anti-Semitism, which is to say that they are about the remote entailments of anti-Semitism. The first example is a very familiar Jewish joke. The second is recounted, among others, by Sigmund Freud in his jokes in their relation to the unconscious, and I offer his version. But number 1, which is not the Freud joke, a Jewish mother offers her son 2 ties for his birthday. Eager to please her, he runs to put one on and reappears wearing it, only to be greeted with, what, so you don't like the other one? 2, this is Freud's telling of this joke. 2 Jews meet in a railway carriage at a station in Galicia. Where are you going? Asked one. To Krakow, was the answer. What a liar you are, broke out the other. If you say you're going to Krakow, you want me to believe that you're going to Lemberg, but I know in fact that you're going to Krakow, so why are you lying to me? The first one is, I believe, something like an Jewish joke, of which I have heard and read countless variations, including both on the Mary Tyler Moore Show in circa 1973, in which Ida Morgenstern, mother of Rhoda, gave 2 scarves to Mary, who was incomprehending at her reaction. And many years later, the same joke recounted by a French academic who's a Proust scholar, so foreign to Jewish culture that she told it as a joke. She told it as a Jewish joke about Christmas presents and could not at first understand why I objected to this detail. I kept saying, no, I don't think that she gave her son the ties for Christmas. And she kept saying, just let me tell the joke. I was thinking, but Christmas, no. Anyway, it didn't go well. We were in a car at the time. What is noteworthy about these stories is that there is nothing explicitly Jewish about what goes on in them, except that the protagonists are always identified as Jewish. This is because the jokes are at least as inherently Jewish as in the other 2 categories, but in a much more implicit way, and also because the behavior they depict would be extremely strange if they were not so identified. In fact, they would cease to be jokes at all. What the stories have in common is something that, if it were not culturally specific, would have to be relegated to the nether regions of psychopathology. If the gift-giving mother were not identified as Jewish, she would simply be abusive, no doubt diagnosed with borderline personality syndrome, and were the two men in the Krakow-Lemberg joke not labeled Jews, it would become a story about clinical paranoia, a possibility Dr. Freud fails to note. In short, these jokes are about a certain form of culturally ingrained, historically induced attitude of permanent suspicion. It is presumably because of centuries and indeed millennia of persecution that the Jews are associated, and associate themselves, at least via such stories, with this attitude of global mistrust and pessimistic refusal to give anyone any benefit of any conceivable doubt, but thus associated they are. To the extent that Groucho Marx's club line is read as referring to anti-Semitism, it belongs to this category. But since it doesn't actually say this, it has also given rise to an ad hoc psychological label with apparently universal application. Where Proust is concerned, however, this association is not this attitude is not associated with Jewish culture, nor is it played for laughs. Instead, it's what happens when people fall in love. Jealousy in Proust's world entails exactly what we find depicted in the second joke in the third category. The jealous person always assumes he is being lied to, is never prepared to believe anything his interlocutor or anyone else says, and when confronted with what appears to be the truth, can only conceive of it as an especially clever and elaborate form of subterfuge. The one thing that cannot ever happen in this scheme of things is for the lover to believe what the beloved tells or anyone else tells him. In short, large parts of Proust's novel, much of Swan in Love, specifically those parts not taken up with social comedy, and almost the entirety of La Prisonnière, as well as passages from other volumes, read like extended expansions on the Krakow-Lemberg joke, with respectively Swan or the protagonist and Odette or Albertine in the roles of the two Jews in the train station. The only difference is that Proust's lovers know why they're being lied to, but then so does the Jew in the train station, because that's what everyone always does. As for the other two categories of Jewish jokes and their applicability to À la recherche du temps perdu, the second would seem to require little explanation. From one end of the novel to the other, starting with the snob Le Grandin's denunciation of snobbery and proliferating throughout with a special reference to social status, sexuality, and on occasion ethnicity, we find endless examples of people who give themselves away in the very act of hiding whatever it is they're ashamed of. Thus, the candidate for membership in the New York Athletic Club and the hapless martini spiller would find themselves right at home in Proust's world. Finally, I will conclude with my first category, jokes which bear direct reference to anti-Semitism. This form of humor bears a somewhat uneasy relation to Proust's novel because of the latter's own uneasy relation to anti-Semitic discourse, which has led to protracted arguments about the author's Jewishness, anti-Jewishness, etc. It seems to me that is Proust Jewish or anti-Semitic, a good Jew or an anti-Semite, is not a useful question to ask, nor can it usefully be answered. But in terms of the representation of Jewishness and anti-Semitism in his work, I would point to Albert Bloch, alias Jacques Durosier, as the novel's closest thing to the reader of Der Stürmer in my first joke. Bloch's character came into existence, as far as I can tell, as the result of the author's inability to find a way to resolve the problem posed by the scene in Combray, in which the grandfather identifies all the protagonist's schoolmates as Jewish, whether or not they display any signs to that effect. Proust wrote many versions of this scene in which we first meet Bloch, and the main or even sole function of which seems to be to demonstrate that the family is truly Catholic and not at all Jewish, which to Proust apparently meant being anti-Semitic. He therefore turned his Jewish grandfather, Nate Veil, with his jocular habit of asking whether his grandson's schoolmates were Jewish, into the protagonist's mildly anti-Semitic grandfather who does the same thing with a different valence. Proust tried a number of different approaches to this scene and kept changing the grandfather to a great uncle and the like, but on all of them he ran into the problem of Swan being at once the witness and focus of these casually anti-Semitic remarks. Eventually, he split the Jewish character in two and created Bloch, who then rampaged golem-like through the rest of the novel, acting as Swan's foil, the embarrassing Jew with his portable shtetl and boundless parvenu ambition. In sum, the Recherche, in accordance with its capacious and contradictory nature, is filled with both comedy and Jewish jokes, just not at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very well-constructed, very dense lecture. We have some time for questions.
Yeah, it's kind of dense, it's true.
It is dense.
It is. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. It's fascinating.
It's a bit dense, it's true.
I am going to
I was
start,
trying to say too much.
I'm going to start with a question, if you don't mind, but maybe I should not, but still I will. It has to do with, so if I understand you well, part of what you're saying is that, in a way, is the dynamic of anti-Semitism, of what, when you speak about jealousy and, in a way, paranoia, and you're saying that this has become at some point, maybe in the late 19th century, early 20th century, something that is associated with Jews, but that in Proust works in a much more general way, right? You can have this kind of happens in a relationship, in same-sex relationships, and you all the time.
All relationships.
All relationships are that. So I was wondering about this and thinking, does it have to do with the fact that Proust is at some kind of transition moment in history? I mean, this is a moment that, like historians of anti-Semitism say, this is the moment of transformation of anti-Semitism from anti-Judaism to a much more racial, and you could maybe make an argument that, late 19th century is a moment in European history where there is a kind of crystallization of identities, or that, following this model of anti-Semitism where, racialization, or all the theories about homosexuality that emerges, or psychoanalysis that emerges, right? Where people make categories and typologies about people. I was just wondering about what is happening with that moment in Proust, right? This is not Jewish humor, because in a way Jewish humor doesn't exist yet, does it? Is it something that comes a little
Jewish
later?
humor exists at this point?
In a way that you were describing as a response to kind of an anti-Semitism that is just crystallizing at the
Yes,
time.
I think you see that in Gluck's family when they banter together, yeah. Yeah, I think so.
They practice Jewish humor.
They do, yeah, I think they do. Actually, I haven't really, because you didn't ask me this question a while ago, I didn't actually go and look at that, but sorry. So yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to go and look at that. Yes, I think so. I think so, but I would have to go back and look. I think they do.
But that would be maybe the same kind of humor that, like homosexuals would use.
Yes, yeah. It's in-group
right?
humor, yes.
In-group humor
Yeah.
of people who are targeted and stigmatized.
Yes,
right?
yeah, it's
They respond to that, but that's
right.
not specific. Is it specifically Jewish in this? You know what I mean?
I would have to go back and look at the scenes in the Gluck family with Nissim Bernard, and I think there is, but this is just my guess, because again, you asked me a question that is the question of a historian, and so I can't answer it because I'm not a historian. But I guess I could try to fake it better than I have just now. But
that's the only questions I can ask.
We'll discuss this further at another time. That's a really interesting question, and I can't answer it.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. One of the things that's really central to comedy is timing, and to humor in general, especially when we think about Jewish humor and like late stand-up, recent stand-up, like Jerry Seinfeld, for example, and Proust.
I'm having trouble. Could you just?
Oh yes, sorry.
I'm deaf.
I was saying that one of the things that's central to comedy is timing.
Yes, I heard
when
that part.
About modern Jewish humor, like Jerry Seinfeld, a stand-up comedian, and timing. Proust is also sort of a master of weaving different time scales together. Did you see any relationship between how he uses humor and how he learns from comedy and how he depicts time?
Oh my God. Another question I can't answer. That's an interesting point. I don't know. I'll have to think about that. Thank you.
name of the book that you refer to several times in the early part of your talk?
Goffman's book?
Goffman, G-O-F-F?
It's Irving, E-R-V-I-N-G. He's great. Goffman, Goffman. It's called Stigma, and the subtitle is Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity, and I believe that it was published in 1961 or 2. It's great. It's a little thin book. He's great. Goffman is really great. You should all read Goffman. I'm sure you already are ceaselessly pursuing the reading of Irving Goffman. He was a sociologist.
And is your talk a paper or a part of a book or that you've just given us?
Oh God. Well, here's a question I can answer, although I don't really want to. So this paper, for a number of years, I was pursuing the writing of a book that was called, on our website, it was called something more academic. It was called Proust of the Marx Brothers. And you can see that is not an inappropriate title. And then, so for a number of years, I was trying to write this book, and I had a hard time for various reasons. And then I wrote this, and then I thought, you know what? That's most of what I want to say, so I'm just going to move on to something else. So I don't know. My answer is I don't know. Maybe. No, your question does not admit of a maybe. It's a paper. I have not. I don't know what to do with it, really. I haven't decided what to do with it.
Hi. To respond to the point about timing and humor in Proust, I think a large part of my finding reading Proust a very amusing experience is often the punchlines, the stuff he wants us to laugh at, come at the end of the sentence. So he enables, through syntactic inversion, often the butt of the joke or the action to come at the end of the sentence or at the end of a paragraph. I don't know if Professor Ladenson would agree or could speak more to that.
Probably. I hadn't really thought about this in those terms, but yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Oh, I'd like the shoot. Yeah, I mean, I think he shares that with lots of other, yeah, I think that's probably true. Thank you.
You mentioned that Proust was a Dreyfusard, and was there any outward manifestation of that in terms of writing, not the novel, but a political statement, or was there any outward expression of that?
He signed a few petitions. He tried. I mean, he tried to do that in Jean Santé, but he couldn't figure out how to do it, how to position himself. I mean, there's certainly stuff about the Dreyfus Affair in the novel, but he very deliberately. I mean, he deliberately. When I say he very deliberately, I mean I mean, he says this in letters, so I'm letting him be the judge of that. He deliberately makes sure that there's almost nothing that would indicate a political position on the part of the narrator. And I think that, in fact, at some point he actually says, like, this is one of the. So, I mean, he deliberately, that was not what he was interested in doing. What he did, he signed one petition, in fact, that and then was cited by an anti-Semitic newspaper as having been one of the Jews signing this petition in favor of Zola, I think. And then he got very upset because, and he wrote to, I don't know, Robert Dreyfus or something. He said, they cite me as one of the Jews having signed this, but I mean, in fact, I'm not Jewish, so I'm not one of the Jews signing this, but I want to write in and say that I'm not one of the Jews signing this, except that would seem kind of like I was trying to, like I thought being a Jew was a bad thing, and so I'm not going to. He was a man who got into a tizzy a lot, So he, yeah, I mean, he didn't take a whole lot of public stances on this kind of thing.
I apologize. I couldn't get in, so I missed the first 15 minutes or so of your talk. Thank you for
Then
your
it is
talk.
I who apologize.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
So you may have spoken extensively about the character of Swan at
I
the
did
beginning
not,
of your talk.
actually.
Well, Swan is the hero and a Jew and a Dreyfusard and pays a terrible, tragic, I mean, entre guillemets, tragic price for that, you know, through the course of the novel. So I don't know how one can say, maybe that's just my, you know, maybe I'm looking at it from a very specific perspective, but I can't imagine that that's not a heroic and at least an empathetic a supremely empathetic presentation of a character.
Sure.
So doesn't that indicate some
Liking of Jews? Somewhat.
that his Dreyfusard stance and the
Yeah,
price that
sure.
is
Oh, sure.
paid?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. Yeah. I mean, the Swan is a somewhat mercurial character. I mean, in the beginning, he's at the same time the Jew everyone knows, and at the same time, he's really barely a Jew at all. And then he becomes. I mean, Proust is really not interested in consistency and realist consistency, and so there are things that don't make sense in the first volume, and there are things that don't make sense between the first volume and later volumes that he didn't bother to go back and correct because he just wasn't interested in that. But and the fact that Swan, I mean, Swan has I think that Swan was. Swan changes over the course of the novel, and what Proust wants to do with Swan changes, and a lot of the time those changes aren't really seamlessly justified because he just doesn't. But I don't think that I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying. I think you're right. No, I didn't quite say that. I said in answer to the gentleman's question that he explicitly attempted to avoid taking a political stance in the novel, having his narrator or his protagonist take a political stance in the novel. But I mean, it's also true that in that novel, I mean, there are all sorts of kind of insane things that happen, like because the narrator, the narrator protagonist, wants to show us all sorts of crazy things, and so he behaves in somewhat crazy ways in order to do so. For instance, pertinently, when Charlus starts raving on about how he wants to ask your handsome Jewish friend Gluck to beat up his old camel of a mother for his entertainment, or to beat up his father because that would be kind of amusing, what the protagonist responds, you think, oh my God, what's he gonna, like, how is he gonna respond to this? And as you'll recall, he says, Madame Bloch est décédée. So, I mean, Proust was really very cagey about these things. Sometimes there's sort of a political stance that's kind of gets taken, but he basically wanted to avoid that. I think he wanted just to be read by everyone, and he just wanted to increase his chances of being read and accepted by everyone. So he wasn't going to. He didn't want to be put into any what's the metaphor that I want? Any boxes? Yeah, right. Boxes. Thank you. I think that's. Oh yes, I mean, yeah, he spent his time putting people in boxes, and I think that's one of the craziest moments in the novel is when Charlus rants on, just truly deranged. Because I mean, among other things, that scene makes it extremely clear, and I'm sure that this was among other things like a Montesquieu-related move. But I mean, among other things, it's clear that anti-Semitism is like sexually charged, is eroticized for Charus. And all he can say is, like, it would be so hot if we got him to beat up his disgusting old mother. And all the protagonist can say is, Madame Bloch is dead. Madame Bloch has passed away. I mean, it's crazy. It's really, really crazy. It's really crazy. I mean, it's nuts. Because you don't. Well, I mean, I was very surprised when I got there. I thought, say something, damn it. Aren't you going to say something?
Just a couple of things. One, Proust was a very committed Dreyfusist. He signed the petition on the first day, the day after Zola published J'accuse. Proust is really on the first page of L'Aurore. So he is among the very few first signatures. And this is what occasioned what you mentioned, the article in La Libre Parole, which mentioned the list of young Jews who had collected the other signatures. So Proust was responsible for the only academician that supported Zola, who was Anatole France. So the signature of Anatole France was obtained by Proust. So he was a very committed Dreyfusist for 2 years, from fall 1897, when it exploded, to the fall of 1899, was when Dreyfus was pardoned by the president. And after that, he didn't follow. Once Dreyfus was pardoned, he had no interest, but of course the Dreyfusists then became more committed in the separation of church and state. So it was more of a leftist movement, so he stopped completely. But like others, Daniel Halévy followed the same course, so it's not exceptional. And then in the novel, there are a couple of lapses about the Dreyfus Affair. One, the narrator has a duel about the Dreyfus Affair. So he has to have some commitment. And two, there's an episode when there's a fight in the family. And this is probably a very autobiographical note, because there was a fight in the family because both Proust's mother and his brother were Dreyfusists, while his father, who was a Republican civil servant of a high rank, if he was not anti-Dreyfusist, was at least a defender of the army and the nation. So there was a fight in the family, and the fight appears in the novel with some tension in the family of the narrator about the Dreyfus Affair. So there are some moments where we can see, let's say, the politics of Proust in the family of the narrator. And there are at least these two episodes where we can see that the narrator was
But you called them
Dreyfusist.
lapses.
What?
I mean, they're lapses.
Well, I call them lapses, but of course they are in the novel. The novel is published, and these are not in posthumous volumes.
Right, but there are all sorts of things in the novel that
there are many
published.
inconsistencies, but when we have a text, we have to deal with the information that is in the text.
That's true. Thank you. Thank you. What?